The night of Celeste Harmon's gallery opening was the kind of night that makes you forget you have a regular life waiting for you somewhere. I remember standing outside the Whitmore Arts District in Chicago, under a string of lights that someone had draped between two old brick buildings, and thinking, I do not belong here. My friend Bex, not my Bex from this list, my actual friend Rebecca, who goes by Bex, had dragged me along because her client was one of the featured artists and she needed a plus one who wouldn't embarrass her. I was wearing a black dress I'd bought 3 years ago for a work holiday party, heels I'd already regretted twice on the walk from the parking garage, and absolutely zero desire to spend a Friday night talking about art I didn't understand. But the champagne was real, the crowd was warm, and somewhere around the second glass I stopped counting the minutes until I could leave. That's when I saw him. Not in a movie way, not slow motion, not across a crowded room, with our eyes locking in some cosmic recognition. He was standing near the back corner arguing quietly with a man in a gray suit, and what caught my attention was that he was the only person in that room who looked less comfortable than me. He kept glancing at the exit. He kept adjusting his cuffs. And when the man in the gray suit finally walked away, I watched the tension leave his shoulders in one slow exhale, and he looked, for just a second, like a person who was completely exhausted by his own life. I understood that feeling intimately. His name, I would learn eventually, was Calloway, Stellan Calloway, though everyone in his world just called him Calloway, the way you'd say a last name like a title. He was 34. He owned 4 private security firms and a logistics company that I later found out moved things across international borders with a speed and discretion that had nothing to do with FedEx. He was 6'2" and had the kind of face that looked like it had been through something. Not rough, but weathered around the eyes in a way that made you curious about the story. But I didn't know any of that on Friday night. On Friday night, he was just the man in the corner who looked like he wanted to leave, and I was just the woman in the outdated dress who felt the same way. And somehow that was enough for my friend Bex to catch me looking at him and say, "Oh, you should go talk to him," in the tone she uses when she already knows something I don't. I didn't go talk to him. I refilled my champagne instead. He came to me, not smoothly. He actually walked up and said, "The painting on the left wall, the blue one, does it actually mean something to you? Or are you standing near it because it's close to the heaters?" And I laughed before I could stop myself because he was so direct about it. And I said, "The heaters. Absolutely the heaters." And he smiled and it changed his whole face, and we stood there for the next hour talking about everything except the art. He was funny. That surprised me. Not performatively funny, not the kind of man who tells jokes, but dry and observational in a way that felt like he was letting me in on something. He asked what I did, and I told him I was a contracts attorney at a firm downtown, and he asked if I liked it, and I said, "It pays well," and he said that's not what I asked, and I didn't have an answer for that. I told him my name was Margot. He said it like he was testing the weight of it. "Margot," he paused, "it suits you." I don't know how long we talked. Long enough that the crowd thinned and the catering staff started quietly removing glasses. Long enough that Bex appeared at my elbow at some point, with a look on her face I'd need to deal with later. Long enough that I forgot, genuinely forgot, that I had a 9 a.m. deposition the following Monday and a dry cleaning pickup I'd been avoiding for 2 weeks. When the gallery started closing, we moved outside. The string lights were still on. It was cold in that specific Chicago way where the wind finds every gap in your coat, and without asking, he took off his jacket and held it out, and I said, "I'm fine," and he said, "I know," and kept holding it, and I put it on because I am not actually an idiot. We kept talking on the sidewalk. And then on the corner. And then somehow we were at a bar 2 blocks away, that he apparently knew. A small place with good bourbon and low ceilings, and a jazz quartet tucked into the back corner. And we sat in a booth and kept talking, and I had one more drink than I should have on a stomach that had mostly just processed champagne, and at some point the talking stopped and there was just the music and the warmth and the way he was looking at me like I was the most interesting problem he'd encountered in a long time. I don't remember deciding to stay. I woke up in a bed that was not mine. The sheets were the kind of white that only happens when someone either spends an obscene amount on a hotel or has a housekeeper who knows what they're doing with bleach. The duvet was heavy, The ceiling was very, very high. Light came through curtains that someone had drawn almost all the way but not quite, and through the gap I could see it was still early. Gray sky, the suggestion of sun but not the real thing. I lay completely still for approximately 4 seconds. Then I sat straight up. I was wearing what I remembered wearing. My dress, thankfully. Though my heels were placed neatly beside what appeared to be a custom-built wardrobe the size of my apartment's second bedroom. My bag was on the nightstand. My phone was inside it, battery dead. The room was enormous and completely silent. I stood up carefully, like the floor might be different here, and crossed to the window and pulled the curtain back just enough to see that I was high up, very high up. In a building I didn't recognize, looking out over Lake Michigan going silver in the early morning, which meant I was on the Gold Coast, which meant this was not a hotel, this was someone's home. I turned around and Stellan Calloway was standing in the doorway, holding 2 mugs of coffee, still dressed, watching me with an expression I couldn't fully read. "Good morning," he said. I said, "Where am I? My place?" He said it simply, not like it was a particularly interesting fact. 14th floor. You can't see the building from the street, it's set back. I need to go, you can. In a minute. He walked across the room and set one of the mugs on the nightstand near my bag, far enough that I didn't have to come close to him to pick it up. That detail registered. "There's something I should tell you before you do." I picked up the mug because my head was pounding gently and I needed something to hold. "What?" He sat down in the chair by the window, not on the bed, not close, and looked at me steadily. "Last night, around 2 in the morning, before you fell asleep, you said something to me." "I was asleep when I said it?" "You were almost asleep. We'd been talking and you were." He paused, chose the word carefully, fading. "And you said, I think if we'd met differently, this would have gone somewhere real." I stared at him, and I said, "It still could." And you said, "Okay, let's decide that. Right now, you and me, that this goes somewhere," and you held out your hand. He looked at the window, I shook it. The room felt very quiet. I stopped. "That's not an agreement to anything." "I know." He looked back at me. "I'm not holding you to a handshake made at 2 a.m. I'm telling you because you asked where you are, and I wanted you to understand the full context of why you're here. You asked me to stay. I didn't want you to think otherwise." I sat down on the edge of the bed because my heels were still off, and the floor was cold marble, and I needed a moment to sort through what he was saying. He waited. He was good at waiting. I'd noticed that the night before. He didn't fill silences nervously. "I asked you to stay," I said slowly. "Or I asked to stay here," the latter. "And you let me." "I put you in the guest room," he said. "I slept in my room. The door between them doesn't lock from either side, which I should have told you. But I also didn't want you to feel like I was making it strange. You were safe." I thought about that. I believed him, which was a separate interesting problem. "The handshake," I said. He waited. "What exactly did you understand that to mean?" At 2 in the morning, something moved across his expression that might have been amusement, but kept itself contained. "I understood it to mean you wanted to try. To see each other again. Not," he stopped, "not anything more formal than that." "Then why does it feel like you're telling me this carefully?" He set his own mug down. "Because I looked you up this morning. Margot Pelletier, contracts attorney, Kessler and Finn. You graduated top of your class at Northwestern. You took the Chen Williams case pro bono 2 years ago and won it. You are," he said, "considerably smarter than most people I meet, and I thought you deserved a conversation that matched that." I stared at him. "You looked me up, yes, this morning, before you woke up." I should have found that alarming. There was a version of this moment where I found that alarming. But the way he said it, not defensive, not sheepish, just honest about it, landed differently than it should have. "Why?" I said. He picked up his mug again. "Because I wanted to know if last night was an accident or a beginning." That sentence sat in the room for a long moment. I drank my coffee. It was very good. The kind that someone has ground fresh that morning, not the kind that comes from a pod. That detail told me something about him too. I was cataloging details automatically, the way you do when your brain is trying to make a decision before your feelings catch up. "I need to charge my phone," I said finally. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a charging cable. My specific type, which meant he'd either found one in my bag or had thought ahead, and held it out. I took it. Our fingers didn't touch. I need to know something, I said, plugging my phone in. Asks, what do you actually do? Last night you said private security, but you said it the way people say things when they're giving you the short version. The pause was brief but present. I move things, he said. Sensitive things, for clients who require discretion. Security infrastructure, proprietary materials, people who need relocation without announcement, legal things, mostly. That word sat there between us like a stone dropped in still water. I looked at him for a long moment. He looked back without flinching, without explaining further, without trying to soften it. He'd given me the accurate version, and he was waiting to see what I did with it. I thought about the way he'd argued with the man in the gray suit the night before. I thought about the tension in his shoulders. I thought about the fact that he lived on the 14th floor of a building you couldn't see from the street. Mostly, I repeated. There are aspects of my work, he said carefully, that exist in legal gray areas. I don't move weapons. I don't move people against their will. Everything I've done I could justify to any attorney. He paused, including a very good contracts attorney if it came to that. Is that why you looked me up? No, he said it immediately. That's not why. Then why? He looked at me with an expression that was almost exasperated, like I was asking a question whose answer should be obvious. Because you were interesting, Margot. Because you spent an hour telling me what your job pays, instead of what it costs you. And then you caught yourself and changed the subject. Because you have a tell when you're about to say something true. You look at the floor first. Because I spent 4 hours talking to someone for the first time and I can't remember how long and didn't want to stop. He picked up his mug. Those are the reasons. My phone buzzed as it found enough charge to turn on. 11 texts from Bex. 3 missed calls from a number I didn't recognize, that turned out later to be the parking garage alerting me my car had been there overnight. I read through Bex's messages without responding. They escalated from "Where are you?" to "I will find a body if I need to finally, "Okay, you're clearly alive and fine and I expect a full report." I set my phone down. "Tell me about the gray areas," I said. He looked at me for a long second. Then he leaned back in the chair, and something in his posture shifted. Not relaxation exactly, but a kind of decision. Like he'd been waiting to see if I was going to bolt, and now I wasn't bolting, and so he was adjusting accordingly. "Sit down," he said. "The coffee'll get cold." I sat, and he told me. Not everything. I'd learn later that there were layers he kept back that first morning, and I couldn't honestly blame him for that. But he told me enough. He told me about a client 8 years ago who'd needed to move a family out of a situation that the State Department wasn't moving fast enough on. He told me about the government contracts that had introduced him to a world where the rules were written differently. He told me about the moment he'd crossed a line he'd drawn for himself, and the 2 years it had taken to understand what that cost. He was precise about it, not confessional, not trying to make me feel sorry for him, just accurate, the same way I was precise in deposition prep, giving me the facts and letting me build my own picture. I asked questions. He answered them. When I asked something he wasn't going to answer, he said, "I can't tell you that yet," instead of deflecting, and I noted the word yet. Outside, Chicago came fully awake. The light changed. My phone charged back to 40%, and then 60, and I didn't look at it. At some point, he got up and came back with toast and a bowl of fruit and set them on the table between us. Like it was a normal thing to do. Like we were two people who had a normal Saturday morning situation. And I ate the toast because I was genuinely hungry, and the weirdness of that. Of sitting in Stellan Calloway's apartment eating toast, while he explained the moral taxonomy of international gray market logistics, struck me as so specifically absurd that I almost laughed. "What?" he said, watching me. "Nothing." "Keep going. You're smiling." "I'm processing," I said. "Keep going." He kept going. By 10:30 I knew more about him than I knew about men I'd dated for 6 months. I didn't know if that was intentional on his part, or just a function of him being the kind of person who communicated in actual information, but I was sitting with it. "The handshake," I said eventually, because we'd been circling back toward it for an hour without landing. He waited. "I'm not holding you to it either," I said, in case that wasn't clear. It was clear. "But I'm also not." I stopped, tried again. "I don't not want to. See you again. I'm just being honest about the fact that I don't know what I'm walking into." He nodded once, slowly, like I'd said something he already knew. That's fair, he said. That's more than fair. Are you in danger? I said it directly because I needed the direct answer. Sometimes. Does it follow you home? He was quiet for a moment. It has before. I've restructured things in the last 2 years to make that less likely. I can't promise you it never will again. I thought about that. I was a contracts attorney. I spent my professional life identifying exposure and assessing risk. I was, by nature and by training, a person who looked at all the possible ways a situation could go wrong before deciding whether to sign anything. But there was something about sitting across from a man who told you the risk plainly, without minimizing it, without dressing it up, who said sometimes and meant it and didn't pretend otherwise. That made the calculation feel different from every other calculation I'd ever done. Okay, I said. He looked at me. Okay, what? Okay, I'll see you again. I picked up the last of my coffee, which had gone cold. Not because of a 2 a.m. handshake, because I'm choosing to. Something moved in his expression, not relief exactly, but the absence of tension. Like a breath. I'll take that, he said. I put my shoes on. I found my coat on the hook by the door, which meant he'd hung it up the night before, which meant he was that kind of person. I put it on. I picked up my bag. He walked me to the elevator without asking if I wanted him to. At the elevator, he said, I'll text you. And I said, you don't have my number, and he said, I'll find it. And I gave him a look, and he said, I'm kidding. I'll wait for you to text me. I pressed the button for the lobby. The doors started to close. Margot, he said. I put my hand out to stop them. He was standing in the hallway with his hands in his pockets, and the exhaustion I'd noticed the night before was still there around his eyes. But there was something else now. Something that looked like the earliest possible beginning of something it was too soon to name. Last night wasn't an accident, he said. The doors waited. No, I said, it wasn't. I let them close. In the elevator going down, I leaned back against the wall and looked at the ceiling, and listened to my own breathing, and thought about the specific fact that I was descending 14 floors from the apartment of a man who moved things across borders in legal gray areas and had shaken my hand at 2 a.m, like it meant something, and that instead of running I had asked him to keep talking, and that I was going to text him, and that I already knew I was going to text him before I'd even gotten to the lobby. The doors opened to a marble foyer. A doorman nodded at me without comment, which meant this kind of thing was not unusual here, which told me another thing about Stellan Calloway that I filed away. Outside, Chicago was fully Saturday now. People with dogs, people with coffee cups and headphones. The lake in the distance doing what it always does, indifferent and enormous. I called Bex from the sidewalk. She picked up on the first ring. Alive, I said before she could speak. Obviously, she said. Tell me everything. I stood on the Gold Coast sidewalk outside a building I couldn't see from the street, and thought about how to compress the last 12 hours into something speakable. I think, I said slowly, this might be the kind of thing that changes things. Bex was quiet for a second, then, Margot, is this a good thing or a dangerous thing? I watched a woman walk past with a yellow Labrador, who was very interested in a paper cup in the gutter. I think, I said, it might be both, and it was. It was both, almost immediately, in ways I wasn't prepared for and wouldn't have traded, which is a strange thing to say about a life that got considerably more complicated starting that Saturday morning. But it's the true thing, and that's the only kind of thing worth saying. I texted him from my car, with the heater finally kicking in and Lakeshore Drive visible through the windshield. This is Margot's. Not an accident, he replied in 40 seconds. I know, dinner Thursday. I'll find somewhere with actual heaters. I set my phone in the cup holder and pulled out of the parking garage and drove home through a city that looked exactly the same as it always had and felt, in a way I couldn't have explained to anyone who asked, entirely different.